Позвольте начать.
Dear friends, allow me to begin our panel. It's called a round table, but we're actually sitting in a line. Pharmaceutical industry, both Russian and international, has turned about to face our citizens. And our session is called Long-Term State Contract, Pro and Contra. Let me introduce the speakers of today's discussion. I have the honor to be the moderator of this session. I'm the partner of medical projects of the 21st century, St. Petersburg, which includes many Russian companies, labs, scientific and research institutions. Among our speakers are Zakhar Goland, chair of the board, Union of Pharmaceutical and Biomedical Clusters of Russia. Zakhar Goland is also the chair of Business Russia Pharmaceutical Division. Dmitry Morozov is Director General of one of the most successful companies that work in Russian Federation and those that export their production to industrial countries of the world. The company is called BioCAD. Florentin Scarlett is International Government Affairs Director of company Abvia for Middle East, Central Europe and Africa. And Florentin also works on links with Russia. Mr. Stolpner is chairman of the board of DTC IIBS, Berezin Medical Center. Chris Janssen is senior director, head of innovation center in Russia for Johnson & Johnson. Thank you very much to our speakers for finding a chance to participate in this discussion. The theme is very important for us. During the last 2 years, we've been participating in the legal forum and we've been following a number of sessions. Today, this time, we received an offer from the Ministry of Justice and the Ministry of Industry to hold a separate panel. And this is a huge achievement of the latest years because during the course of developing the program for the 2000s and further years, very efficient mechanisms have been created. In St. Petersburg, a partnership was created, including most domestic and research labs, institutions. We are now standing on the positions we're defending the creation of pharmaceutical industry in Russian Federation, developing legislation. So the name of today's section is very relevant both for domestic producers and foreign investors who are developing their projects in Russia, or for those who plan to make serious investments, or for those who think about major projects. Since the idea of long-term government contract has been in development for a long time, the most recent thing that happened in this area were the two-man agreement. In two-man, a decision was made to send to all state authorities directions for developing state contracts, which created an impetus for further developing this idea of government contract. This very idea was taken very recently on the 16th of May on the territory of the Special Economic Area, Neudorf in St. Petersburg, and the Special Council, the Innovation Council of the President of the Russian Federation, mostly on the pharmaceuticals and medical technologies. And the successful conducting of this presidium resulted in a resolution which had as one of its major points to include mechanisms and tools for creating long-term government contract for delivery of pharmaceuticals and attracting investment and localization of the producing of pharmaceuticals in Russia. The ideas that were listed here and the term that was set before by the 6th of October, an opinion has to be developed. So Mr. Montrov and Ms. Kortsova have to be responsible for this. So today's discussion will have resulted in a resolution on part of the legal community. And by the 6th of October, the government of the Russian Federation will receive a proposal regarding this topic. So today's innovation system in pharmaceutical industry is dictated by very serious conditions regarding the implementation of a system to invest major assets by government and private investors. So long-term contracts is a kind of a mechanism, is a kind of tool that is both beneficial for the state, for the government, because the government would be able to plan in advance the purchases and the roadmap for developing on different directions depending on the priority programs. It is also beneficial for investors because if investors understand that they have a 5 to 7 year long contract, we're speaking about plants, labs, innovation clusters. So everyone who's present here at our discussion and the market itself would be interested in this production to be in demand. The level of investment is very high, and the Russian market is interesting for many actors. And the tools that we're developing now are those tools that in the future would be accepted by the government to improve the investment climate. I would like to give the floor to Mr. Golland because right now we have to understand, are there any limitations and what impedes on the state level, on the government level, to implement this program immediately, to implement the long-term government contract immediately? What happened after the 94th Federal Law, Federal Law 94 was replaced by the Law 44? What was happening to all the ministries that are responsible for the development of traditional and innovative technologies? Mr. Golland, please. Dear colleagues, the very idea of setting tasks for long-term government contracts is something that is interesting both for producers and consumers. In December last year, instructions were given to all ministries to develop corresponding programs for long-term contracts in our industry. It was confirmed in May, and certain specific terms were set. Unfortunately, we understand quite well that right now there is a certain practical contradiction which impedes the possibility of concluding such government contract. The first basic contradiction, which will take a long time to remove, I'll list a few blocks of legislation. The whole financial system is structured so that it impedes. If we take the public health system, the budget is not consolidated. The government contract presupposes centralization, but when the budget is not consolidated, when we're not just speaking about budget legislation, but also contract legislation, Federal Law 44, which protects the right of every budget recipient, which gives unlimited rights for creating an order. And there are certain forms of Law 44 which allow to create purchases that create certain authorities that can make central purchases, and there are certain norms to do that in the law number 44. So before this legislation to create centralized purchases of certain products, before that neither of the ministries had basis to do that, even though they had instructions to do so. So from the point of view of budget legislation, we'll have to collect the money that has already been distributed and which is the basis of activity of any budget organization, and only after that to solve the problems of these government contracts. Then there is Federal Law 135, which adds another contradiction. Why at the legal forum it was rather urgently decided to create a session like that. I can give you an example with the government-state partnership. This problem has been discussed for state-private partnership has been discussed for a long time. It will be discussed today as well. Not just long-term contracts for the delivery, but also for ordering certain medical services and concluding long-term services for medical services or state-private partnership. We didn't have a federal law on state-private partnership, and all attempts to propose a law like that were not successful. Even the law that was discussed didn't have any norms, any stipulations that would allow to create any successful state-private partnership. Even though we have such laws on a regional level in St. Petersburg, they don't fit the medical field. But however, these are well-developed laws. The main thing I want to stress is when we conclude long-term government contracts or state-private partnerships, the normative basis to describe the tools, the authorities, the rights of the supplier and the state authority authorized by the state to conclude that kind of contract. This is very important. Even if this contract is just concluded without any tools, it creates huge risks for the officials, for the authorities. Such contract can be at any time questioned, or it could be qualified as surpassing one's authority or non-specified expenditure of public funds and so on. So the conclusion of such contracts, if the authorities are not aware of that, and then when certain specific contract is discussed with a certain investor, half a year later, such projects just dissolve and they end in nothing. The same thing happens with investors, even if they are able, if they happen to conclude a contract. The same risks, which are administrative risks for state authorities, become business risks for the investors, because such contracts can be questioned as well. It is our opinion, and this is something we work on, that on the regional level, in spite of a very specific government-set task, and the task is given by the federal ministry, we think that it would be faster to come to the practice of private state-private partnership and long-term contracts on a regional level in major regions of the Russian Federation, both in long-term contract, both in medical services. It becomes more clear, more understandable in terms of Russian regions. So in both these topics, we have certain models on medical services, and we're only beginning the work to understand what state authorities have to do, what an investor has to do when we speak about delivery of products. There is a long-term project that is now in the Health Ministry regarding medical equipment. They're trying to create a tool to do that, but without legislation tools. The criteria for selecting the supplier, for specifying the prices for such equipment, the terms. In the absence of such tools, all decisions seem arbitrary. It's they are difficult to be taken in the first place, and then can be questioned later. It's good that the federal government finally speaks about that, and this is basically a done deal. So the direction is clear, the instructions have been given, but we didn't have enough time for all those involved to understand the complexity of the task. You know full well that yesterday and the day before yesterday, the Ministry of Industry and Trade have been given certain demands, and there are certain aspects of the foreign policy that influence the situation. And in certain spheres of federal strategy, including the pharmaceutical industry, the political pressure has only become stronger, and the legislation will probably move quite fast in the direction of creating such tools. In budget legislation, in contract system legislation, in the issue of Law 135, just as it's done in the state-private partnership, will probably have to pass a long-term federal law on long-term contracts, which will be probably regulated by a separate law. It's not being discussed right now, but I think in half a year's time it will be probably set as a separate area of federal legislation.
Well, thanks God, the situation in the market when we have supply in exchange for investment. If you give the market, you need to assess the investment that can be brought to or can be implemented in the Russian Federation. The system itself, if we go back to the procurement of medical of drugs on the Russian Federation, it's this market is on the second place, second after the construction market, and major buyers spend up to 200 billion rubles to procure drugs. And each investor should understand the strategy and the plans of his own company, and he should understand, I mean, what terms is he talking about, when will this money be returned, and whether a company will participating in the market, how will it influence the market and the Russian healthcare system. We know that there's a lot of experience in the world in this area, and we're probably talking about this long-forgotten planned economy we once had. We're talking about I mean, we're talking whether it's economically sufficient, or but we forget about planning. And it's good that Zahar mentioned the military industries. And today, our government is addressing pharmaceutical industries and innovative industries, uh, and we're, living in a very interesting period when we ourselves can provide for uh, both for Russian companies and for the Western companies that invest in Russia. If we're talking about long-term contracts, it is beneficial for the local producers and for their products to be in demand. We're not talking about Western goods being bad. No, on the contrary, up to 50% of the uh, money returned to the government, it is brought back to the people working in the industries. It is invested in jobs, in research. So it is very important for us. But it can only happen when we have an understandable, planned distribution of means and of offers. I would like to give a word to Florentin Scarlat because we're interested in international experience and how long-term contracts work in other industries and in other countries. What can influence? Uh, how do they manage to create this attitude towards long-term contracts? What does it involve? Research, or is it just procurement, or is it R&D research? Could you share, Florentin? Could you share some international experience working in a big company like AbbVie? How do you see how it can happen in the Russian Federation?
When it comes to the pharmaceutical industry, it's important to recognize the fact that it does not function as least as other business sectors. And we also have to distinguish between specialty care products and primary care. When we talk about specialty care, and this is an area where AbbVie specializes. So when we talk about the specialty care, which is an area where AbbVie specializes, we usually talk about highly specialized drug treating diseases that do not necessarily address a large number of people, with sometimes biologic medicines. Therefore, we don't always speak about a high volume of drugs. So not having in mind a high volume of drugs, it is difficult to localize or to build manufacturing facilities in many countries around the world, because generally when we look around, the highly specialized pharmaceutical companies have 1, 2, 3 global plants whereby they are able to supply most of the global demand. That being said, I think in this specialty care, most companies do not generally invest in every country they're doing business, unless sometimes we talk about big market opportunities, fast access to the market, a good regulatory and IP protection environment, and the market potential. There have been in the past, I think, and Turkey might be the best example, attempts to have the pharmaceutical industry localized, to have offset agreements. And I think when we talk about offset agreements, we also have to look what does that mean, the investment, because in pharmaceuticals it's not only about building plants and producing locally, but could also be conducting clinical trials. It's also a partnership with academic institutions, could also refer to the medical education for the healthcare system. So when we talk about the healthcare system, when we come up with a new drug on the market, we also have to give the possibility to the healthcare professionals to know how to use and administer the drug, to teach them and to provide medical education. But I think when we look at the way we operate as an industry, we have to split between product registration, which means all the time since the molecule is discovered is being authorized, is for being brought on the market, and market access, which generally refers to pricing and reimbursement. So in order to register the product, you have a long time where you have to conduct preclinical trials. And I think this is also important for Russia. As far as I know, Russia requires 3 years of local clinical trials. This is something I think at some point has to be discussed in the way that clinical trials conducted somewhere else should be also maybe sometimes accepted. But I think the biggest and most interesting part comes to the market access. And you mentioned earlier long-term contracts. Of course, most of the pharmaceutical companies would accept and would support the idea of having long-term contracts, because the long-term contract gives you the possibility to plan your business long in advance, and you are able also to recover your investment. But in pharmaceuticals, sometimes long-term contracts are not always taking place, and we also have to see, which are the therapeutic areas or the companies do need to invest. Because if we talk about a company which develops in the specific a specific drug in a therapeutic area that is not currently financed in Russia, then you cannot go probably into a long-term contract. Now, I would also like to refer to the Pharma 2020 strategy of the Russian government, which is an attempt to increase the research intensity of the local pharma market. And I think this is also critical that for such an endeavor, there needs to be a partnership with foreign R&D companies. Then again, in order to increase the R&D share of the market, I think it's also important to look at the examples that we have in the world. So you have sometimes very small countries which do have a lot of pharmaceutical investment, and I think the biggest and the best example is Singapore, where a lot of pharmaceutical companies have not only production facilities but also R&D facilities, and that has mainly to do not only with the legal environment, but also with additional financial incentives that the industry gets there. So for a pharmaceutical industry and for a company like AbbVie to consider long-term investments, I think it's a very complicated process, because we talk about global companies, and when you plan the future of a global company, you also have to look not only at the regional and local business opportunities, but for example, also how do you distribute production among different already existing production facilities. When it comes to medical education, of course, we are already doing that, and that's much easier. We have a partnership with universities, also I think here in St. Petersburg. We do conduct clinical trials, but it has to do always with the also with the market access of the product. And again, I do consider that the possibility of such contract is a good sign, but that needs to be also looked into the global perspective.
Спасибо большое, Флорентин.
Thank you very much, Florentin. We understand very well that the global experience, it exists, and it is very important for us, not to make certain mistakes. And since we view companies and your company as our friends who can give us hints and tell us, share their experience, and you have a long-term vision of our partnership. And for this matter, we value the fact that you're here, and we value your recommendations as well. Uh, Both in Russia and in the Russian and in the world, we understand that St. Petersburg is the capital of pharmaceutical industry in Russia. Uh, it has always been the capital of pharmaceutical industry, both before October Revolution and in the Soviet times. And thanks to the efforts put by our companies and our government, we're gaining back the status of a pharmaceutical capital of the Russian Federation. Um, Petersburg becomes a place for international forums. For example, now, parallel to our forum, there's an Adam Smith forum going on, where participants also discuss long-term government contracts for the pharmaceutical industry as well. And I would like to use this opportunity and congratulate our Biocad company and Dmitry Morozov is present here. This company has gone a long way, hard way. They were the first to register rituximab, and they built a great facility in the Neudorf Special Economic Zone. Uh, and the city sent all the documents necessary to promote and this company, and it would be it's interesting for us to see the situation when this plant was being built, and they received subsidies to develop the technology and create a production line using monoclonal antibodies. Everything was built, but the first contract was signed with the government of Brazil. I will never forget when Dmitry came up to Veronika, uh, telling her that they had their first long-term contract with Brazil. Unfortunately, the contract was not signed with the Russian Federation government. So, Dmitry, you did a great job, and I always feel your positive vibe and your. Uh, we also have a Life Science Invest Forum in St. Petersburg. It's a forum for experts in pharmaceutical industry. And once I asked Dmitry when we did our first forum, what should we show as a showcase, or we should show the companies that understand what success is, and everybody is interested in success portfolio. Dmitry, the success portfolio of your company, does it depend on long-term government contracts, and what is to be done?
Yeah. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. Dmitry made a very interesting introduction about our international project, but I really believe that we have a very good understanding of where we're going. We act within a certain trend, and I would like to highlight these trends first, and then I will go on into specific issues. It's quite obvious that there are some global paradigm changes that covers some of the business sectors, especially knowledge-related business sectors, science-intensive, knowledge-intensive sectors. And this is a very important trend. It is related to the raising of self-consciousness of local governments. And I will explain what I mean. When we look at the BRICS countries, and we are very active in those countries, we can see that the local governments understand that they do not want to supply raw materials to the so-called developed pharmaceutical countries. They don't want to supply raw materials only. They don't want to supply to the US or the EU, because that reminds us of the colonial policies. Remember when the Portuguese came to Latin America, they broke glasses that they had, they broke looking glass, and the small pieces of glass were exchanged for precious stones. This is a very known fact, and that's a story that came down from the those who went to Latin America at the time. And we can see now huge pharmaceutical companies that take Russian petroleum dollars in exchange for their little bottles with medicines. So we get these little bottles with a very high added value and tell us that they are the only ones who can produce these bottles, while we are uneducated and unclean and cannot possibly ever be able to manufacture anything like that. So we have to sell them oil, we have to sell them gas, and buy these little bottles. The same happens in Brazil. It's a typical colonial attitude. Well, as I said, we are very active in Brazil, and we can see that a similar scenario is followed there. When you talk to people from other countries in similar situations, for example, in China and other countries, not everything is simple in China. Not as simple as that. Some of our Chinese colleagues and the Chinese government have been able to resolve some of the issues, but nevertheless the general situation is very similar. So when we talked to the Ministry of Health in Brazil, they told us that they have the same thing. They have oil and gas, they have a number of exporting sectors, and the big pharma come with little bottles, the prescription drugs that they sell, and tell them that they are the only one who can manufacture that. So we continued that discussion, and they would tell them that in our market we have our own um, ambitious plans, and we would like to replace some of these drugs with those that we can manufacture in Brazil. In Brazil, they have a private public partnership program, and we are not talking about investment only, because investment is a very specific issue, and a lot of countries have a lot of investments. In fact, there are a lot of development institutes that deal with investment issues, especially in the knowledge-intensive sectors. It's a problem of know-how. It's an issue of knowledge. Where do you get this knowledge that is lacking in these markets? Traditionally, the pharmaceutical industry was not very well developed in Brazil. We know that Brazilians were very good in aviation, in other industries, but pharmaceutical industry has never been very strong there. So we have some specific tasks. We want to replace certain drugs with homemade. We understand how much it would take, and the question is, will you be able to manufacture it for less money? And then we say, if so, we can take 100% of everything you manufacture within the period of 5 years. But then you have to follow a specific technology transfer schedule, and you have to teach, and in about 5 years we'll be able to manufacture that. So it's a very clear, very concrete position for us as a potential investor, as a donor of technology. We see it as a very clear position. The position of the other side, that offers the market, this policy is clear as well. Let's look at the Russian Federation. The situation with the Russian Federation is a bit different. I think we have decided to follow a very positive trend. The Ministry of Health was able to formulate a clear position. They said that we are not a colonial market. We are a market that has a range of quickly developing, fast developing high-tech companies, and they not only develop, but they also have their own R&D program. So we have a different story here. We're not Brazil. Dmitry was right in saying that we have a lot of experience in developing various pharmaceutical areas, biotech areas. This is a traditional industry here, although it has not been very strong. The Soviet Union was focused more on the nuclear bombs and the space industry. In a way, the pharmaceutical industry was not a priority, and when the market was opened, it was not supported well enough. But the pharmaceutical markets that we have today, with all the difficulties, with all the problems it faces, the pharmaceutical community that was formed developed because of the market that was open to the huge pharmaceutical actors. And you know what happens to the market when it becomes open? What kind of policy can be implemented when the colonial trends persist. You have a wild market in terms of pricing. You can play by the rules that are arbitrarily adopted, and that, of course, is not very beneficial to various players in this market. We can see now that there are a lot of initiatives on the part of the government. There are a number of initiatives, legislative initiatives on the part of the pharmaceutical community, and it may seem like a very private, very small issue, but things will change, and the situation will never be as it had been before. We are witnessing the formation of a long-term contract system. In my view, it is not as clear as it may seem. It's quite controversial. The strategy, I believe, for long-term contracts should follow two components. We need to have very clear understanding that the long-term the medicines that are manufactured long-term should be later replaced with the local manufacturer. Otherwise, you only use the local market to manufacture packaging. We're talking about the entire cycle, starting with substances to the packaging. So we're talking about the transfer of technology and its transplantation to the local markets, and that includes the training of local personnel. And the second element that needs to be taken into account is this: anti-corruption measures need to be taken. We understand that there's a lot of money behind these contracts. We are aware of the fact that there are some non-market factors and non-market mechanisms that can have a play. Potentially, if any of the market players get a long-term preference in the format of a 5-year contract, other participants in the market will lose a lot of opportunities. The door closes for 5 years and you will not be able to come out into the market with a similar product. So that shuts down the competition, which means that you have to change the strategy. So there are a lot of unanswered questions. There are a lot of unresolved issues. If we have a contract that was placed regardless of the market trends, then you may incur some strategic losses. I believe that a system of this kind should be very well thought through, should have a anti-corruption review, and I don't see any other way out. If the government, and we are clear that the government is going down that path, if the government wants to play the market in exchange of technology, of knowledge, and knowledge is the most important, most precious commodity today. Pharmaceutical companies sell knowledge. Pharmaceutical companies sell their knowledge of how the body works, and what they sell is molecules, small bottles or pills. It's the knowledge that matters. It's the main element of what they sell. There's a lot of discussion about intellectual property, and there are a lot of unresolved issues there, because there are a lot of long-term patents that are generated by the big pharma. They are only indicative and sort of stake the territory, whereas if you go deep into this area, you understand that it's not serious, that the patents are not serious. So there are a lot of issues. Another issue is the changing rules of the game. We have to understand, all of us, that as soon as the patent expires, all the market players should follow the same rules. When the patent expires, you should forget about extra profits, super profits, and you should engage in the same conditions and engage in the same rules of the game and play by the same rules as other companies. Imagine the situation someone concludes a long-term contract just on the eve of the expiration of a patent, does that mean that this company may be able or would be able to be a monopolist in the market for another 3 years? So there are a lot of issues that need to be taken into consideration. If we want the Russian Federation to continue working in the area of intellectual property, and I should say that there are not the legislation, the IP legislation works pretty well, then why should we talk about long-term contracts? The companies are protected by patents that in fact protect their interests across the world. So it's a complicated issue that has a lot of factors playing into it. I agree that there should be a separate legislation covering these issues. There should be bylaws. I believe that at this point in time there are a lot of unclear issues that need to be cleared. If there are any questions, I would be happy to take them. Thank you. Thank you, Dmitry. I believe that we will take questions when all the speakers have been able to deliver their presentations. And I'm sure that the audience will ask questions. We have here in the audience people who are active participants in the market, who promote the idea of long-term contracts, who support the cooperation between Russian companies and foreign companies. You were right in saying that knowledge is the most precious commodity. Unfortunately, there is so much there's not enough money that is spent on fundamental sciences, even compared to the times when we mostly supported rocket technology. The cluster technology is thriving, and we can see important clusters being generated by established research centers. The Chemical Pharmaceutical Academy of St. Petersburg is one of such think tanks, and it is well known in the world. It has a very big training program. I would like to use this opportunity and congratulate Zakhar, who was named rector, vice rector for research and development of this Chemical and Pharmaceutical Academy. This is a very important development, and it supports the idea that Dmitry mentioned, that knowledge is the most precious commodity. Zakhar was one of those people who promoted the Federal Law 44, and I'm sure that he would be able to implement some of the ideas that he always supported in his work as one of the managers of this academy. The long-term government procurement contract should take into account the interests of the government, the municipalities, but on the other hand, there is also the subject of the contract. The subject of the state procurement contract should specify very clearly what kind of services are provided under this contract. A lot of people say, why would anyone want to build inefficiently, manage ineffectively, and invest money in accordance with Federal Law number 44 into something that would require a lot of money? And only later we see that the idea of the federal law is actually in spending money on treatment and getting the money back for medical drugs. We have one of the most expensive investment projects in the country. It's a very significant project, a very serious decision that was made by the Berezin Center. It is headed by Mr. Stolbner, who is present here. We're talking about the creation of a proton center in St. Petersburg. But as I said, labs, factories, facilities are not built by companies because they want to show they're better than others. They are built because companies want to improve the health of our citizens. The service that they provide, the work that they implement should be appreciated. Unfortunately, the inefficient way that the government manages the funds, and you will see later the coefficients that are used for calculations. One of the coefficients that is used is the coefficient of the government money that is spent for various state procurement contracts. And so if you look at the number of patients that we have to cover by these contracts, the number of the amount of equipment that is supposed to be bought, we will see that no more than 30% of this equipment is being actually used. I was very surprised to find out that only 30% of the keyboard is being used in some pieces of equipment, and the rest of the buttons remain foreign to medical doctors. I understand that for you, the relations between the state and companies is very important. I'd like to hear from you what you think about the long-term government procurement contracts.
Um, Thank you, Dmitry. Thank you, dear colleagues. Thank you for this opportunity. This is a very important topic for us. I'll start with a proverb. We say, don't listen to what people say. It's always about the money. We do speak about the money. We discuss the most important thing, who is paying and for what they are paying. In a sense, we're a separate case because we don't produce anything. We provide services. We use the results of the pharmaceutical and medical industry, the results that they achieve in the form of producing pharmaceuticals and complex medical equipment. For us, it is indeed very important who is paying for what. $200 billion, as far as I understand, was the figure was quoted, the purchase of pharmaceuticals. This is something that the government is paying for. On the medical service market, which is being spoken about, it's very promising, and the demand is huge for high quality medical services and demand for medical services, but people forget to say that it's not supported by demand. The main purchaser is the government. According to various evaluations, the share of private medical services is 3 to 5%, which is very small. We all expect major growth, but I wouldn't expect a major growth unless the government would be financing these processes, because so far the government has been the main purchaser, the main buyer. Dmitry has mentioned that lots of money is being used, and after long construction, expensive equipment is being bought. Then it arrives earlier than the construction is done, sometimes several years earlier. Then it remains in storage, then it's installed, sometimes it's put into operation. Before that you have to train the personnel and to start using it and spend lots of money to maintain it. $50 billion was spent for the construction during the Olympics, but the main thing is that now we'll have to maintain all these facilities, and we're discussing who is going to be financing that. At the end of this wonderful procedure, we have a medical service for which the government is prepared to be paying. What's very important for me, to whom the government will be paying? Just to state-run institutions, or it doesn't matter? What kind of medical institutions provides the services to the end consumer? If the government doesn't mind or doesn't care, then for us, the tool for concluding long-term state contracts, government contract, is one of the ways out for today. to solve the problems that we're facing. I'll give you a couple of examples. We were one of the major investors in the medical area, in private medicine in Russian Federation. And the volumes of investment during the last 10 years, about $200 million, and in the next 4 or 5 years, another $250 million. The project of proton therapy in St. Petersburg is worth $140 million. It's a huge project, and it's a project that uh, has long terms of implementation, from taking the decision to the clinical launch. The international practice uh, that it takes about 4 to 5 years. And we're building the center in Dimitrov that and we hope that we will launch it rather soon. So if the construction takes 5 years, how can an investor be planning such major investments if the investor doesn't understand who is going to pay for these services, or he's at the mercy of the market, which cannot pay for it now? Certainly, with the qualifications given by Mr. Dmitry Morozov, we have to work out market mechanisms of selecting those organizations that can conclude government contracts. With this qualification, because otherwise we lose market opportunities, with this qualification, I think this is a very important chance, maybe the only chance, because the state-private partnership that's being discussed now, this is something that I don't really understand in the forms uh, that are being developed today. Just one example. In one of the areas, in one of the regions of Russian Federation, we're in talks to uh, to construct a center for radiation oncology. And they tell us, do come, it's very important for our region. We'll support you in everything. We say, great, we're ready to launch this project, but right now we have in St. Petersburg, which is not very far from your region, and we have the facilities that are idling. Could you support them? Could you give us the money for 30 or 40 people and start sending people who need this kind of therapy to St. Petersburg? And this creates a situation of surprise. People can't put two and two together. They can't link these two processes to send 30 or 40 people to finance these kinds of activities, and the wish to have a wonderful modern uh, facility that will be probably abandoned, as many federal institutions are, because in the middle of the year or at the end of the year, they just grind to a halt because there is no money to treat the patients. This is how I evaluate the prospects of long-term government contracts. This is wonderful. We would like to conclude a long-term government contract with St. Petersburg or with the Federal Health Ministry to somehow make our projects more secure. And another important thing, we don't want our projects to be 100% funded by government contract. We want to have 80% or so. We need 30 or 35% of anchor, but everything else we'll find on the open market. Thank you, Arkady. I know from the things that you say, I understand that this is a very painful problem, because about Arkady has about 83 centers all over Russia, and they are centered on the office in St. Petersburg. If there are complex cases, you can receive high quality medical assistance from our St. Petersburg specialists and scientists. And this creates a flow of patients. Today, the queue of the patients is quite long. who need to receive high quality, high technological procedures, and certain private institutions can take part of this flow, and they sometimes offer discounts even compared to the state evaluations. But if the state spends the money to maintain and um, um, service the things that the government has built, the private institutions include that in their tariffs. The implementation of such a project now in 2015, it will be quite clear, I think, that the initial stage before we launch this Proton Center right now, this is a very important thing for us. I was talking at the council, at the presidential council, and when we were talking about the points of the government contracts, if the uh, term is October the 6th, for this contract, it's October the 7th. So the next day, several federal ministers have to receive uh, proposals for financing from the federal budget for 2015-2017 regarding innovation, diagnostics and prophylactics, and personified medicine for the state program of the Russian Federation. The development of medical and pharmaceutical industry for 2013-2015, the development of nuclear medicine and biomedicine. Let's hope that today's event um, will give an impetus, because this is something that we're discussing. This is something that will have certain legal importance for the government, for the state. If within the economic forum we're concluding a number of very important contracts, this year a very important contract was concluded with a profile industry, the Council of Medical and Pharmaceutical Clusters of Russia, and St. Petersburg is at the head of this union. It includes Kaluga and Moscow region, the Association of Innovative Regions of Russia, which includes other regions. And this union is a serious lobbyist for the things that are important for many regions. The problems of long-term government contracts that were lobbying for this industry are the priorities of this union. We signed a contract, an agreement with the Union of Industry, and we will be developing the directions that are specifically important for each ministry. These recent years were very important because we have been building a cooperation between several profile ministries. We had the program Pharma 2020. The Ministry of Health was um, taking some specific decisions. The Ministry of Justice didn't support it, but right now this is a systemic program thing. These ministries are now working as a single body, um, with understanding that if the money is earmarked for a specific ministry, other ministries have to support them, because the end goal is the health of a patient. Those who are present during today's discussion, Biocard and Debbie and Johnson Johnson and our partnership and Mr. Stolpner's Santa and the Union of Biopharmaceutical Clusters, we represent an important anchor, an important direction to develop our pharmaceutical and medical industry. But the most important thing is we see the key issues that are interesting for investors, those that can give a good return on investment, that will be a good tool for the healthy market. Mr. Chris Janssen is one of our speakers here. Mr. Janssen has been working in Russian Federation for a long time before his most recent appointment appointment when he became the Senior Innovation Director of Johnson & Johnson. He's been for a long time, since 2011. He was the Scientific Director and the Biomedical Cluster in Skolkovo, Russia, and his work in Skolkovo helped him analyze what is the interest of many investors, because uh, 250 new members of the cluster um, joined the Skolkovo cluster. An international expert commission of 450 people was created. Um, Greece understands very well what is interesting for investors, what follows what, and after that he received an invitation uh, to become the head of an interesting innovation um, department in Johnson & Johnson. Chris, I would be interested in your opinion regarding the long-term government contract. Uh, with consideration of your work in Skolkovo, you were asked by an investor, how can you guarantee, apart from your businessman's word, how can you guarantee that the things we're doing will be in demand? Please join our discussion.
Thank you, Dmitry, for your kind invitation and introduction. I don't really feel I've been for a long time in Russia. It seems like yesterday that I arrived. I would like to take a step back when thinking about the complexity of long-term contracts and to think, what are we trying to achieve? What is the end goal? And obviously there are two aspects to this. First and foremost, addressing unmet patient need. At the end of the day, it's all about therapy, about curing people and having a healthier population, which will hopefully lead to a wealthier nation. On the other hand, there is the creation of economic stability and predictable, stable income for companies that will hopefully lead to the kind of investment that Dmitry just asked me about. I think we need to look at the threats and opportunities that this presents. We heard earlier that, of course, when we have long-term contracts, we tie our healthcare system to certain therapies. And depending on how long the long-term contract is, this may limit, actually, the access of new innovation to the market. On the other hand, if a company is going to invest significantly in innovation, in fostering collaborations and tech transfer, and in localizing both its R&D and production, it needs to be able to rely on a stable and predictable income in that regional location where it does that. So I would agree with the previous speakers that we must handle the issue of long-term contracts, how to assess them, how to monitor them, and how to implement them very carefully. From the perspective of Johnson & Johnson, we have globally dedicated ourselves to an innovation program in recognition of a global issue of lack of pipeline of new medications to address both emerging diseases and emerging resistance in diseases for which we thought we had treatments. And I would like to point out that actually a lot of the issues that Russia faces are global issues. They are not specific to Russia. You look at European countries who are trying to leverage their knowledge, inherent knowledge for the economy. They themselves find it difficult when supporting innovation-driven industry to actually then bring the fruits of this innovation to the market. And industry has faced issues, for example, in Europe, when heavily investing in R&D there, that the results of this R&D didn't actually access that market, that we had problems registering our therapeutics, our drugs. So I would say that what we are facing here now is not just Russian-specific, I think it's a global issue. Coming back to why I mentioned innovation, in recognition of this global issue, J&J has globally understood that we must start looking to brand new solutions, to different ways of doing things in order to, first of all, address patient needs better, to address these patient needs long term, and to actually ensure that we have viable products that are marketable and that are reimbursable. So in general, I would advocate that long-term contracts do give us the kind of stability that encourages us to invest. And how do we invest? We would invest in the full life cycle. We are searching for innovation worldwide. And when we find it, we support it, we invest in it, and we try to help to commercialize it and bring it to market for the global market as well as the local market. I think Russia needs to think beyond actually serving its own healthcare needs, but progressing to a state where it can export its expertise, export its products, and become a player on the world stage. I would say that from our perspective, we have been already actively for many years as Johnson & Johnson searching in Russia for innovative ideas and partnerships. We have been one of the first pharmaceutical companies to bring new drugs to Russia, for example, against multi-drug resistance TB. We're partnering with local pharma, again, for both clinical trials and finally the commercialization of those products and bringing them to market. We see long-term contracts in general as an incentive to help us continue in this vein, to deepen our investment and our engagement in Russia. Having said that, we are very much aware of the pitfalls and the threats, and we would like to advocate a careful monitoring of any such program to ensure that it's flexible enough to respond in real time to changing patient needs. In other words, changing indications, changing efficacy of the treatments as we watch them actively in the population. And secondly, being also responsive to new innovation. In general, with the sad state in which the global pharmaceutical drug pipeline is, it's fairly predictable what's coming up. But nonetheless, we're hoping that as increased investment in Russian biopharma sector occurs, we will see more rapid advance of technology in Russia, more rapid innovation, and its maturation to commercialization stage. So I think it would be counterproductive to lock things in such a manner that this commercialization cannot actually be brought to bear. Coming back to the question of Skolkovo, how do you guarantee? Well, you cannot. There is an inherent risk, there's a big risk in pharmaceutical development. A few years ago, the industry had hope in personalized medicine. Already 10 years ago, personalized medicine was the big trend. Everybody said this will heal everything, our problems. We're going to find biomarkers. We're going to have the specific drug for the specific person, and everything will be well. Well, it didn't work. We're still working on it. We're still hoping. But it shows that since we haven't given up hope in this, the need for localization, patient-specific, patient group-specific, geography-specific, the need for local research for addressing specificities, genetic specificities, cultural specificities of local patient groups, and therefore, again, the need for local investment and localization. And we are fully in favor of this, and we fully support this. The next issue, of course, is the IP issues. I think that in Russia, actually, IP issues have been solved very well. I think the Russian IP law is very good, and we are seeing its implementation improve daily. So I don't really see a problem there. I would say that coming then to the issue about generics, which was addressed earlier, what happens when IP expires? What do we do then? How do we handle this in terms of long-term contracts? I would advocate thinking very carefully, again, in the assessment program for drugs or therapies that are eligible for long-term contracts, that again, we do not limit ourselves and we do not limit the availability of drugs and potential drugs and the derivatives to the patient population, because at the end of the day, this is our goal, to basically help patients. And we have to make sure that we do not forget that in our attempts to improve the economic situation for investment. Public-private partnership has been mentioned a few times, and I think this is one of the services pharma can do. We call it the service around the pill. How can we contribute to the healthcare system beyond little bottles? A lot of reference has been made to the little bottles. Little bottles themselves do nothing, but their content is, if properly administered and if properly brought to bear, can have impact on health. And impact is what we want at the end of the day. Without impact, we don't have a market, we don't have a product. And this impact we can both facilitate and actually produce by ensuring the right educational programs, public-private partnership in services around the pill, which includes social services, which includes contributions to the actual healthcare system, which we must not confuse with the actual pharma itself. And at the end of the day, I think also we must not forget that investment in infrastructure and healthcare system is one other major component that will drive the improvement of healthcare and health in the Russian Federation. Now, I also concede that circumstances for pharma and for medical devices and service centers may be very different. And that the considerations for a more stable infrastructure investment are most likely to be less critical than for drugs, to which you can very rapidly, if falsely used, develop resistance, which may be superseded by new innovations in drugs very rapidly, or which may, as it may turn out, have greater or lesser efficacy according to genetic makeup of specific populations geographically distributed. So I think, again, we need to differentiate in both the implementation, assessment criteria, and monitoring between service infrastructures, devices, and drugs. I think that that's about all I would like to say. I think I've covered quite enough, and hand back to Dmitry.
Chris, thank you very much. You told us you were looking for partnership. You found it already. I will be very glad if such a big company, an important company like Johnson & Johnson, will assess what St. Petersburg has to offer and will assess our partnership and our achievement and our companies, local companies that work here, and will be very happy if this partnership that you're talking about will, come to life in St. Petersburg, in the pharmaceutical capital of the Russian Federation, and we have experience working with AbbVie and with other local companies, with Gamma Pharm, with Polysat, with Biocad. Maybe the idea of these long-term government contracts is not is not about these little bottles and what's inside them. It's the final point. What do we see as a service? What do we view as a service? Is it therapy to a certain person, or if we assess the programs now launched by various companies, we should understand what contracts and with whom can we conclude, because there are a lot of programs like this one about hepatitis, women's health programs, where every participant can find their place according to the products a company makes, and this will be the essence of this contract. But it won't be out of context. It will be a link in the roadmap for certain program. I know that Dmitry Morozov is also very active in supporting this program thing, and when the service is paid for, and the patient should understand what what does his treatment include, what kind of tests they should take. Well, recently in St. Petersburg we had a very interesting session on hepatitis in the Legislation Assembly of St. Petersburg, where we tried to assess those services and see what categories of patients we can have and what should they be treated with. So we already have some programs and sub-programs as a framework. We should also understand that we have a budget code and annual budget, and we cannot go beyond this limit, this budget limit. How do we set out priorities for the budget in case we don't have long-term contracts? If we conclude the contract today, but it will be actually implemented in 5 years and the products would come to the market in 5 years, what happens, Zahar?
Well, this is this is exactly why I said that I think that the easiest way to conclude such contracts would be to make them in pharmaceutical services. When we talk about products, there are a lot of different limitations. We've talked about them, and there are a lot of problems in the market here. When you give preference to one company, you run into certain risks for all the participants in the market. And until we have specific criteria for selecting products, until we have clear idea of the mechanisms that would be involved in making these contracts, we have to be very careful with this tool. I think Dmitry was quite right in saying that we should look at these government contracts as a tool, as a support measure to help the technology transfer, and the rest of the aspects should be secondary, should be seen as secondary. I believe that knowledge transfer, technology transfer should be the priority, and then the government should try and compensate some of the risks that not only investors but also not only investors run into, but also the transfer of technology involves. Right now it's a finite task. The government does not have any risks. It will only have any risks when the facility has been licensed and commissioned. When the service has already been provided, then the government will pay. So this is our position. Arkady has already described it. We believe that this is one of the key projects for St. Petersburg, for Russia. It is also a very good example illustrating a case whereby a long-term contract is seen as a promise, as a condition to attract long-term investment. There was one more topic that was raised today, and I would like to dwell on it a little longer. If the government wants to render a medical service, it builds for many years, it operates, it maintains and pays for medical services, and it only pays in the end. Why don't we change the system and have the government pay for the service only? It's clear that the efficiency of all these stages are beyond our discussion, whether or not the construction stage is efficient, whether or not the operational stage, the management stage is efficient. I think the government should just pay for the service and regulate the quality of the service. It should get rid of all the secondary stages. It's a good development that this topic is raised both in the Ministry of Finance, in other ministries, and the government, in my view, is following a general trend of trying to get rid of additional assets that would need certain maintenance and operation. I think that about 95% of all the assets in this industry belong to the government, and since there is no money to increase these assets, then it would only make sense to do it this way. The primary medical service structures do not have any government money. Look at the density of construction in St. Petersburg and Moscow, and there's a lot of districts that do not have any primary medical services available to them. Over the past 15 years, we have seen that a lot of people have come to a situation where they are outside the area where such primary medical services can be rendered. So private investment, all kinds of investment, in fact, would be much more efficient than direct investment with the budget money, with the federal money. Because every ruble that you invest from the government money will entail additional funds for the maintenance and operation, whereby the payment for services is a much more risk-free strategy, because if you made a mistake, you can rectify this mistake. So there's still a gap between the amount of medical services provided and the demand. There's still a lot of years that we have to use in order to fill this gap. I believe that, unfortunately, these long-term government contracts may lead to the generation of additional risks for the government, because it may destroy the competitiveness in the market. So I think this idea should become a locomotive that would bring forward the idea of supplying equipment as well. I think equipment supplies should be one of the conditions for such long-term government contracts. I agree to pay for the services, for example, but you have to agree to supply certain equipment that's been licensed, that can be used for manufacturing of certain medical substances. There's one more thing, the assessment of medical technologies. This is something that has been under discussion in Russia for several years already. I already mentioned the consolidated budgets. I think we need to think about how we make decisions, because when decisions are made, we don't have any implementation system that would support this decision, and that's where we come into difficulties. I believe that the health technology assessment methods should be implemented. There should be very specific criteria and a methodology supporting these criteria for the selection of those services and products that would be involved in these long-term government contracts. There should also be a strategy, an ideology, but also a system of implementation. One of the major problems we run into is the fact that when the decision is made, it is not being implemented. In the UK, we have one of the oldest agencies in the sphere says that when a decision is made, it is a compulsory decision anywhere in the medical sphere, whereas here in Russia, a hospital, a medical center can make decisions of their own. And federal law number 44 protects them in that. They may buy anything, whether or not it is efficient, that's a secondary matter. So they may use their own analysis, they may use their own assessment. But if you have the assessment system in place, then we would be able to analyze the procurement patterns within a year, within a quarter, and make conclusions. So we need this trigger. But when the trigger is used, then large areas of legislation would be impacted, large areas of healthcare that would have to be reformed. Thank you, Zakar. I also would like to ask Florentin about his opinion. We've discussed a number of different issues already. It's clear what is the general topic is, but from your experience, what do you think? You've been working in many different countries. Legislation, attitudes are different. What are the countries you would say are the most convenient for attracting investment and that are most interesting for the companies such as your company?
For pharmaceutical industry and specifically for AbbVie, we are looking also the unmet medical needs of the country, you know. So we are trying to see where we can bring an additional value to the patients. Talking straightforward about the investment, I think we don't always look at the foreign direct investment we bring to the country, but also the value that we generate by being present in the country, by improving medical outcomes, by hiring people locally in the country, not generally for necessarily for production purposes, but also for medical education. So it's not only by looking at R&D and production, but also by having the drugs present on the market, you know, you bring additional economic added value. When I look at the countries that I'm working in and I make a comparison, I think each country has its own pros and cons, and it's very difficult to say, you know, which is the country you'd rather invest in. Generally, in the developed markets like Western Europe, due to the fact that there are big pharmaceutical markets and the time to, I heard previously being talked about the health technology assessment. What I want to say is that in those countries, the time to reimbursement of new products is quite fast. Usually the pharma industry focuses on those markets because once you launch a new drug and you have a product life cycle, you try to go to the markets that brings you the fastest time to market the product.
The speaker is not using the microphone. Thank you very much for everyone who was present here. We are nearing the end of our discussion. If you have any questions, we would be happy to take them. We tried to be very clear and comprehensive using plain terms. We wanted to highlight the issues that we face. We wanted to talk about pros and cons, the interests of different players in the market from Russia and from other countries, what our government should take into consideration when developing this idea. It was very interesting to note that we had a delegation from Kazakhstan in St. Petersburg not so long ago, and Kazakhstan is a very proactive country that is looking up to Russia. And when this delegation, headed by Ms. Nazarbayeva, when the first delegation came to St. Petersburg, they visited many different facilities in St. Petersburg. Then other delegations followed. They visited various facilities and they were very impressed. They visited the Palisan factory, and they said that the GMP level, the factory itself, the facility was on par with the best Swiss centers. It's interesting that the people who created this facility only took some major elements, but decided to add a lot of interesting twists. And that only shows that when you have good brains and good hands, you can make miracles. So sometimes when you invest funds here, you do not get the returns here. And other countries, when they assess investment opportunities, they want to have a final product. They don't want to go through all the preliminary stages. And I think this is the main idea. In order for us to be in demand, we have to develop this further. So my question is, if you have any questions. Are there any questions in the room? Thank you for your participation, for being so active. Oh, there is one question, please.
There is no sound in the mic. No sound in the mic.
А я знаю, что просто вот, да, Захар недавно готовил подобные материалы.
Well, Zahar has recently prepared a material like that for Business Russia publication. Could you... I wanted to ask about the fate of long-term government for medical equipment and service contracts in the context of the life cycle of the equipment. How is the legislation going to be developing in that direction? Because people from regions are asking us regarding the tenders. We can't divide our efforts between all the regions. So what are the concepts that are being taken into account? We have to separate the anything that is of the essence, whether these contracts are being concluded with specific companies and so on, and the legal basis for that, because if we lump it together, confusion ensues. There is an area of political rhetoric, and we're there. There is another area of legislation and legal regulations. There is the law number 44. This is a new law. It came into force in January. It includes several tools which are important for medical and pharmaceutical industry, but these tools are not implemented. Life cycle, the national regime of delivery, two-stage procedures for the auctions, special requirements for the tenders, special requirements for the products. Each of these is a separate decree of the government within the Law 44. That doesn't mean that they are going to use that authority. But if a decision was made that it would be expedient to use this kind of authority, it can be used. And regarding medical equipment, for example, there is the so-called excluded third regulation. It's been discussed endlessly. Everyone had certain issues with the list. I had issues with the list. It's again a separate discussion because this list, which is an annex to any decree of that kind, one of the instructions that was given in May, this is the same rule of the excluded third for the pharmaceutical industry. So the tools within the Law 44, they will be gradually put into force by the government. And this rule of excluded third was like the first example of that. Certain other authorities, additional requirements for the participants, for the production, they have not been implemented yet. Even though the main tools for the support of local producers, Novartis that is constructing its plant, its factory in St. Petersburg, AstraZeneca in Kaluga, Berlin Chemi, and we expect that Novartis will be launched next year. So for the companies that are not just localizing the packaging, that are doing something more serious, more, not maybe the full cycle, but certain deeper involvement, the government should not be the government support should not be limited to rhetoric. They would probably like to welcome certain new investment in the primary assets. When we're speaking about the investments, as I said, we mix up rhetoric with actual legislation. Investment. What do you invest in? Transfer our technology, primary assets. Such investments are very small. If we look at the investments in marketing, they only make the medical services more expensive. A certain percentage of such activity uh, when things are when the medical community and the patients receive information about certain new products. But this is something that creates additional value of the product. It's just like you hear on TV that this coffee maker machine is better than the other. Why? You don't know, but you go and buy it. And the same thing is happening with the pharmaceutical industry. If we look at the top 10 drugs on the Russian market, they are being marketed, but they don't have proven clinical efficiency. You have to be very careful here. The rule of the excluded third. If there are two or more local producers, the foreign producers are not admitted to the auction. Everyone was saying yesterday that this practice can be expanded on the government contract, not just in medical and pharmaceutical products, but other types of authorities that are already in place within the framework of contractual system. They are not implemented yet, but next year, the year after the next, I think some of these tools will be additionally used, both for the good and for supporting the investment project or stimulating new investment project. Also, certainly for changing the rules on the market. They have to become different. The import market and the local production market are two different markets that have to be regulated by the government in different ways, at least in the sphere of placing government orders. And the government was very unambiguous about that at the moment when the federal strategy was adopted. The goals were set quite clearly. They're official, both for the health ministry, for the industry ministry, for the economy ministry. This is not just rhetoric. This is a very specific strategy, and the ministries have to adhere to that and to follow the roadmap regarding these measures. To conclude our discussion, I would like to thank our profile ministry, the Ministry of Industrial Policy and Trade, and Mr. Tsiba, who couldn't attend today, the Deputy Minister, but the desire to combine the efforts of a number of ministries and to solve these problems in a concerted effort. This is something that helps us move forward. Thank you to the Ministry of Industrial Policy and Trade. Thank you to the Ministry of Justice, who organized this wonderful forum and included this very important session for discussion. Thank you for everyone present. Thank you to Zakhar and thank you to Dmitry, who managed to squeeze in this session. Thank you to Florentin, thank you to Chris Jansen, thank you to Arkady Stolpner, thank you to those present. I think that the capital of pharmaceutical industry and medical equipment of Russia will find a solution within the terms that have been set, and will support the government with the decisions and the guidelines for these issues. Thank you very much.